Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a world where a warm bed was considered a remarkable luxury. Clean sheets were closer to myth than reality, and checking into an inn usually meant placing an astonishing amount of trust in complete strangers. So settle in, get comfortable, dim the lights if you haven't already, and allow yourself to wander into the long, slow roads of medieval Europe. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these quiet journeys through history. It helps the channel more than most medieval rulers ever helped their kingdoms. Now take a slow breath, relax your shoulders, and imagine a narrow road disappearing into the distance beneath a pale evening sky. The sun has almost disappeared behind rolling hills. Your boots are damp from crossing muddy tracks. Your back aches from hours spent walking, or perhaps from riding a horse that clearly objects to carrying anyone at all. Your stomach has been reminding you for several miles that lunch was little more than stale bread and a piece of hard cheese. Ahead, almost hidden in the fading light, stands a building with smoke curling lazily from its chimney. An inn. To modern travelers, an inn sounds comforting. We imagine polished wooden beams, cheerful fireplaces, friendly hosts, hearty meals, perhaps even crisp linen and a quiet night's sleep before continuing the journey the next morning. A medieval traveler imagined something rather different. If they were fortunate, they might survive the night with all of their belongings, avoid catching an unpleasant illness, wake up without an army of biting insects, and discover that the stranger sleeping beside them had not accidentally or intentionally rolled onto them during the darkness. By medieval standards, that counted as a fairly successful stay. Travel itself was uncommon for much of Europe's population. Most people spent their entire lives within a surprisingly small distance of the place where they were born. Villagers worked fields that their parents had worked before them, attended the same church, visited the same market towns, and measured the passing years by harvests rather than journeys. Long-distance travel belonged to a different sort of person. Merchants followed trade routes connecting distant towns. Pilgrims walked hundreds of miles toward holy shrines. Messengers carried royal orders. Students traveled to universities that existed only in a handful of cities. Soldiers marched wherever kings decided they should. Nobles visited estates scattered across their lands. And, of course, there were the occasional wanderers, entertainers, craftsmen, scholars, and adventurers who accepted that the road itself had become part of their lives. For all of them, night eventually arrived. Unlike modern highways, medieval roads offered very few reliable places to stop. There were no illuminated service stations, no neatly marked exits, and certainly no online reviews warning that one establishment had suspicious stew, while another offered unusually aggressive fleas. Instead, travelers relied upon reputation, local advice, luck, and sometimes simple desperation. As daylight faded, almost any roof became appealing. The medieval inn occupied an interesting place in society. It was neither entirely respectable nor entirely disreputable. It welcomed merchants carrying valuable goods, monks seeking shelter, nobles traveling with servants, pilgrims carrying little more than walking staffs, and occasionally individuals whom everyone preferred not to question too closely. This mixture produced fascinating evenings. Around one fire might sit a wealthy wool merchant from Flanders, a blacksmith heading toward a nearby fair, two priests discussing theology, a group of musicians hoping someone might pay them tomorrow, and a soldier whose stories became increasingly impressive each time another mug of ale appeared. Whether those stories were accurate was another matter entirely. Because literacy remained limited, conversation served as entertainment, education, and rumor distribution all at once. News spread remarkably slowly, yet often became remarkably imaginative along the way. A traveler might confidently report that a neighboring kingdom had crowned a new ruler, only for listeners to discover weeks later that the king in question had actually died months earlier. His cousin had briefly claimed the throne. Two rival claimants had started arguing, and nobody was entirely certain who was in charge anymore. Communication had its limitations. Naturally, this solved absolutely nothing. Still, people listened carefully. Information possessed genuine value. Knowing which bridge had collapsed, which roads were flooded, where bandits had recently appeared, or which market currently paid excellent prices for wool, could influence the success or failure of an entire journey. The inn became an unofficial information exchange. It also became something else. A place where complete strangers willingly spent the night together. Today, many people hesitate before choosing a hotel with fewer than 4 stars. A medieval traveler often celebrated merely finding walls that still stood upright. The appearance of an inn varied enormously. Some occupied former farmhouses. Others operated inside substantial timber buildings, standing beside busy trade routes. Large cities offered more elaborate establishments, while isolated villages might possess only a single house, whose owner agreed to provide meals and sleeping space in exchange for payment. Signs hung outside because many customers could not read. Instead of written names, inns displayed painted animals, crowns, crosses, ships, lions, swans, or dragons. The white horse, the red lion, the crown, the swan. These images became landmarks as recognizable as modern business logos. Although the artistic quality sometimes left room for interpretation. A painted lion occasionally resembled an unusually determined sheep. Upon arriving, the traveler usually entered a busy common room filled with smoke, conversation, cooking smells, damp clothing, and the unmistakable scent of human beings who had spent several days traveling without meaningful opportunities for bathing. Personal hygiene in medieval Europe was rather more complicated than popular stereotypes suggest. People certainly washed, just not always in the ways or frequencies modern visitors might hope. Bathhouses existed in many towns, especially during earlier centuries, but while traveling, regular bathing became difficult. Water required effort to heat. Soap varied widely in quality. Fresh clothing occupied valuable luggage space. After several days on muddy roads, everyone carried at least a little evidence of the journey. Some carried considerably more. Imagine dozens of travelers entering the same room over many weeks. Rain-soaked cloaks drying beside the fire. Leather boots coated in mud. Horses waiting outside after long rides. Cooking smoke trapped beneath low ceilings. Candles burning into the evening. Ale spilling onto wooden tables. Dogs wandering freely. Perhaps chickens exploring with complete confidence that they owned the building. The result produced an atmosphere difficult to describe politely. Fortunately for medieval noses, everyone experienced similar conditions. Humans possess an extraordinary ability to adapt. If everyone around you smells roughly the same, eventually it becomes normal. Dinner usually reflected whatever ingredients happened to be available. Fresh meat appeared occasionally, particularly if livestock had recently been slaughtered. More commonly, travelers received thick pottage, a hearty stew made from grains, vegetables, herbs, and whatever meat could reasonably be added without causing uncomfortable questions. Bread accompanied almost every meal. Cheese appeared frequently. Onions were dependable companions. Ale flowed generously because water quality could vary dramatically. Weak ale often served as an everyday drink rather than a luxury. Contrary to popular imagination, medieval people understood perfectly well that foul water caused illness, even if they explained the relationship differently than modern medicine does. Choosing ale often represented practical caution rather than endless celebration. That said, plenty of celebration still occurred. After exhausting journeys, shared meals encouraged conversation. Deals were negotiated. Pilgrimages discussed. Family news exchanged. Songs quietly emerged. Occasionally, arguments developed, sometimes spectacularly. An innkeeper needed skills extending far beyond cooking. They acted as cook, stable manager, cleaner, accountant, negotiator, referee, local guide, and occasional peacekeeper. Imagine attempting to satisfy a room containing hungry merchants, impatient nobles, exhausted pilgrims, stubborn mule drivers, and professional soldiers. The Royal Misery Scale awards that occupation a respectable 8 out of 10, particularly because everyone expected miracles while paying reluctantly. Good innkeepers earned valuable reputations. Bad ones earned equally memorable reputations. Word traveled surprisingly far. Merchants remembered establishments that treated customers fairly. Pilgrims exchanged recommendations. Carters discussed reliable stopping places. One dishonest innkeeper might lose years of business after cheating the wrong traveling merchant. Reputation mattered enormously. Yet even the finest inn faced a simple limitation: space. During busy seasons, travelers far outnumbered available beds. Which brings us gently toward the night's greatest adventure: sleeping. Modern hotel guests sometimes complain because another room closes its door too loudly. A medieval traveler considered uninterrupted sleep a fantasy bordering on fiction. Private rooms certainly existed. Wealthy nobles, high-ranking clergy, important officials, or exceptionally prosperous merchants occasionally rented them. Everyone else shared. Shared rooms, shared beds, shared blankets, sometimes shared floors, sometimes all of those simultaneously. The idea of personal sleeping space barely existed for ordinary travelers. If 4 strangers occupied one large bed, nobody considered this particularly unusual. Beds themselves represented expensive pieces of furniture. Mattresses stuffed with straw, feathers, wool, or rushes required considerable resources. Building enough beds for every guest simply made little economic sense. Instead, people slept wherever room remained. One traveler occupied the left side, another the right. Someone else squeezed into the middle. Occasionally, children fitted wherever adults could no longer object. Privacy quietly disappeared. So did personal space. Fortunately, exhaustion proved remarkably persuasive. People capable of walking 20 miles across muddy roads rarely remained awake, complaining about their neighbors' elbows. They simply slept, or tried to, because the room itself never truly became quiet. Someone snored, someone coughed, someone muttered prayers. A horse kicked the stable wall outside. Dogs barked. The fire crackled. Wind found gaps in wooden shutters. Babies cried. Drunken singing drifted upward from below. Some unfortunate soul discovered that sleeping beside a complete stranger who had consumed generous quantities of garlic possessed certain aromatic consequences. Meanwhile, insects pursued their own evening activities with unwavering determination. Bedbugs deserve special recognition among history's most persistent travelers. These tiny creatures accompanied humans across continents for thousands of years. Medieval inns provided ideal conditions. Numerous guests, shared bedding, warm sleeping areas, limited opportunities for thorough cleaning between visitors. The bedbugs must have considered themselves exceptionally fortunate. The guests were somewhat less enthusiastic. Fleas joined the gathering with equal optimism. Lice occasionally attended as well. Sleeping peacefully required remarkable optimism, or remarkable fatigue. Most travelers possessed both. Let's drift gently toward another curious detail. Many people carried their own blankets whenever possible. Not because inns lacked bedding altogether, but because trusting unknown blankets demanded courage. Bringing personal bedding reduced certain unpleasant surprises. Unfortunately, carrying blankets also increased luggage weight. Travel constantly involved compromise. Comfort weighed something. So did food. Extra clothing, money, trade goods. Every item demanded careful consideration. Even wealthy travelers discovered that roads imposed limits no amount of status could entirely remove. Kings traveled with magnificent entourages, certainly. Yet they still encountered rain. Mud remained stubbornly democratic. No title prevented wheels from becoming stuck. No crown persuaded rivers to stop flooding. Even the grandest noble occasionally spent an uncomfortable evening wondering why medieval engineers had chosen precisely that location for a bridge. Because of course they did. The inn offered shelter, not perfection. And for countless travelers crossing medieval Europe, shelter alone often felt like an extraordinary gift. The fire continued burning low into the evening, while weary voices gradually faded into soft murmurs. Boots rested beside crowded beds. Cloaks hung drying from wooden pegs. Outside, horses shifted quietly in their stalls, and somewhere beyond the inn's walls, another traveler hurried along the darkening road, hoping to arrive before the heavy door was barred against the night. The innkeeper's final task each evening was to decide when the door should be barred. In a world without streetlights, police patrols, or reliable protection on rural roads, the heavy wooden bar represented more than simple security. It marked the moment when the inn changed from a public gathering place into a vulnerable island of shelter, surrounded by darkness. Travelers who arrived after the door was barred faced difficult choices. They might knock and hope the innkeeper was willing to admit them. They might sleep in a stable, beneath a cart, or under whatever shelter they could find. Or, if conditions were particularly unfortunate, they might continue traveling at night, which medieval people generally tried to avoid whenever possible. Night travel carried genuine risks. Roads were uneven, poorly marked, and often dangerous even during daylight. A traveler could become lost, fall into a ditch, lose a horse, or encounter robbers who understood perfectly well that exhausted travelers made easier targets. The countryside itself could be hazardous, with wolves in some regions and flooded rivers in others. For this reason, arriving at an inn before dark was often a matter of practical safety rather than convenience. A traveler who reached shelter before nightfall had already achieved one important victory. Inside the inn, however, the victory remained incomplete. Once the door was barred, the common room gradually transformed into a sleeping space. Benches were pushed aside. Extra straw might be spread on the floor. Travelers who had not secured places in beds negotiated for corners, blankets, and enough room to stretch out without being stepped on during the night. These negotiations could become surprisingly delicate. A merchant with valuable goods might prefer to sleep near his bundles. A pilgrim might wish to remain close to companions. A traveler with a horse or mule would want access to the stable if something went wrong. Families traveling together tried to stay close to one another, though this was not always possible in crowded conditions. The arrangement of sleeping places revealed much about medieval assumptions regarding privacy and social space. Modern travelers generally expect personal boundaries around sleep. Medieval travelers often regarded shared sleeping arrangements as an ordinary consequence of limited resources. This did not mean they enjoyed every aspect of it. Imagine entering a crowded room after a long day's journey. The air is warm from the fire and heavy with smoke. Cloaks hang drying from rafters. Boots are scattered near the walls. Someone has already claimed the corner nearest the hearth. Another traveler is arranging bundles of cloth beneath a bench. A group of pilgrims murmurs evening prayers, while a merchant carefully checks the knots on his money pouch. You are tired, hungry, and aware that the available sleeping spaces are becoming less desirable by the minute. The innkeeper points toward a bed already occupied by two strangers, and suggests that there is probably room for one more. This was not considered an insult. It was considered hospitality. Beds in medieval inns varied widely in quality. A prosperous urban inn might provide wooden bed frames with mattresses stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers. A poorer establishment might offer little more than a raised platform covered with rushes. In some cases, travelers slept directly on straw spread across the floor. Straw was inexpensive and readily available, which made it practical bedding. It was also uncomfortable, noisy, and difficult to keep clean. Fresh straw smelled pleasantly earthy. Old straw, after supporting many travelers, acquired less appealing qualities. On the royal misery scale, sleeping on old in straw earns a thoughtful 7 out of 10. It was not necessarily dangerous, but it was unlikely to inspire poetry. The mattress itself might be covered with coarse linen or rough fabric. Blankets were valuable possessions, and their condition depended heavily on the inn's resources and standards. Wealthier guests sometimes brought their own bedding or traveling blankets, partly for comfort and partly for peace of mind. Peace of mind was difficult to maintain in a room full of strangers. Theft represented a constant concern for travelers. Merchants carried money, contracts, samples of goods, and valuable merchandise. Pilgrims carried offerings, badges, and whatever possessions they could not leave behind. Even ordinary travelers might have tools, clothing, or small amounts of coin that were essential to completing their journey. Because secure storage was limited, many travelers slept with their belongings close at hand. Money pouches might be tucked beneath clothing or placed under pillows. Bundles were arranged where they could be felt if someone attempted to move them. Valuable items might be hidden among less attractive possessions in the hope that a thief would choose an easier target. This created an atmosphere of cautious trust. Travelers depended on one another's basic cooperation, yet everyone understood that not all companions were equally honest. Innkeepers were expected to provide some degree of security, but their ability to prevent theft varied greatly. A reputable innkeeper might lock valuables in a chest or provide a more secure room for wealthy guests. A less conscientious innkeeper might simply shrug and observe that travelers should guard their own possessions more carefully. Legal systems sometimes held innkeepers responsible for losses suffered by guests, but enforcement was inconsistent. Proving what had been stolen when it disappeared and who was responsible could be difficult in a room where many people had access to the same space. Naturally, this solved absolutely nothing. The presence of valuable goods also attracted less welcome visitors. Bandits and thieves understood that inns along major trade routes could contain merchants carrying substantial wealth. Some criminals may have gathered information in inns before targeting travelers on the road. For this reason, experienced travelers often avoided discussing the full extent of their wealth with strangers. A merchant might describe his goods modestly or speak vaguely about his destination. Excessive boasting could make a traveler memorable in exactly the wrong way. Meanwhile, the inn itself contained hazards unrelated to theft. Fire was perhaps the greatest danger. Medieval buildings frequently relied on open hearths, candles, oil lamps, and cooking fires. Timber construction, straw bedding, and crowded conditions created an environment where a single spark could have catastrophic consequences. Innkeepers had strong incentives to maintain their fires carefully. A fire that destroyed an inn could also destroy the innkeeper's livelihood, the guests' possessions, and sometimes the guests themselves. Nevertheless, accidents occurred with alarming regularity throughout medieval towns and villages. Travelers sleeping in crowded rooms were vulnerable because escape routes might be blocked by furniture, sleeping bodies, or confusion in the dark. A fire discovered too late could spread rapidly through wooden structures before organized responses were possible. Fortunately, most nights did not end in disaster. They ended in a more ordinary sequence of discomforts. The room gradually settled into darkness as candles were extinguished. The fire burned lower. Conversations faded into murmurs and then into the irregular sounds of sleep. Someone snored loudly. Someone coughed. Someone shifted on a straw mattress, producing a rustling sound that seemed surprisingly loud in the night. A horse stamped in the stable below. Wind rattled shutters. And then, perhaps after an hour of restless drifting, came the sensation that medieval travelers knew all too well. Something was biting. Bedbugs were among the most persistent companions of pre-modern travel. These small insects feed on blood, usually at night, and they thrive in environments where people sleep in close proximity. Cracks in wooden bed frames, seams in mattresses, folds in bedding, and straw-filled mattresses provided ideal hiding places. Medieval people were certainly aware of bedbugs, even if they did not understand their biology in modern terms. Various remedies were attempted, including herbs, smoke, washing bedding, and exposing mattresses to sunlight. Some treatments may have provided temporary relief. None solved the problem reliably. A traveler who discovered bedbugs during the night faced limited options. He might try to shake out the bedding, move to another place, or endure the discomfort until morning. In a crowded inn, moving to another place often meant discovering that the alternative location had its own insect population. Fleas were equally common, particularly in environments where animals and humans shared close quarters. Inns often housed horses, dogs, cats, and occasionally livestock nearby. These animals could carry fleas, which then found opportunities to explore human guests as well. The medieval inn therefore offered a complete ecosystem of unintended companions. This was not merely unpleasant. It also contributed to the spread of disease. While medieval people did not understand germ theory, they recognized that crowded, dirty conditions often accompanied illness. Travelers arriving from distant regions could bring diseases with them, and inns provided opportunities for those diseases to spread among people who had previously lived far apart. Plague, influenza-like illnesses, gastrointestinal infections, and various fevers all traveled more easily along the same routes that carried merchants and pilgrims. The inn served as a temporary meeting point for bodies, belongings, and microorganisms. Let us drift gently toward another curious detail. Some medieval travelers preferred to sleep in their clothes rather than undress for the night. This choice had practical advantages. Clothing provided warmth, reduced exposure to questionable bedding, and allowed for quicker departure in the morning. It also protected modesty in shared sleeping arrangements. However, sleeping fully clothed after a long day of travel was not especially comfortable. Heavy garments could restrict movement, and damp clothing might remain cold throughout the night. Travelers constantly balanced comfort against security, modesty, and the realities of crowded accommodation. Morning brought its own challenges. Inns often became noisy before dawn, as travelers prepared to continue their journeys. Horses needed to be fed and saddled. Goods had to be packed and loaded. Breakfast, if available, was usually simple and quick. The shared room that had served as sleeping quarters reverted to a busy communal space. Travelers who had spent the night beside one another might exchange brief farewells before departing in different directions. Some companions would never meet again. Others might encounter one another repeatedly along familiar trade routes. For many travelers, these inns formed a network of temporary communities stretching across medieval Europe. A merchant traveling between major towns might recognize familiar innkeepers, routes, and fellow travelers. Pilgrims heading toward popular shrines often moved in groups, sharing experiences and information from one stopping place to the next. The inn, therefore, represented more than discomfort. It represented connection. Without inns and similar lodging places, long-distance travel would have been far more difficult. Trade would have slowed. Pilgrimages would have become more dangerous. Communication between regions would have suffered. The very movement of people, goods, and ideas depended partly on the availability of places where travelers could stop, eat, sleep, and continue onward. Even a miserable inn served an important purpose. A traveler waking after a difficult night might complain about the noise, the insects, the food, or the cramped sleeping arrangements. Yet he would still be grateful for shelter from rain, darkness, thieves, and the uncertainties of the road. Gratitude and misery often occupied the same room. As dawn approached, pale light filtered through shutters and cracks in the walls. The fire was stirred back to life. Travelers rose stiffly from straw mattresses and crowded beds, collecting boots, cloaks, and bundles while the inn slowly returned to motion. Another day on the road waited outside, with fresh mud, uncertain weather, and the hopeful promise that the next inn might, perhaps, be slightly less terrible. Morning in a medieval inn rarely began with the gentle comfort that many modern travelers expect from a quiet hotel breakfast. There were no soft mattresses inviting guests to linger, no fresh coffee drifting beneath neatly painted ceilings, and certainly no leisurely morning spent deciding whether to check out before noon. The day usually began because everyone else was already awake. The stable boys had been moving about long before sunrise. Horses needed water, fodder, and brushing before they were willing participants in another day's journey. Carts required inspection. Harnesses had to be tightened. Merchants counted their bundles once more, partly from habit and partly because they trusted arithmetic more than optimism. Inside the inn, the fire crackled back to life as the first meal of the day slowly appeared. Breakfast was generally practical rather than memorable. Bread from the previous day remained perfectly acceptable. Fresh bread, if available, was appreciated but never guaranteed. Cheese appeared again, proving itself one of the most dependable companions of medieval travel. Ale often accompanied the meal, particularly weak ale brewed for daily consumption. To modern ears, this may sound unusual, but weak ale usually contained far less alcohol than many beverages today, and was often considered a safer choice than uncertain water supplies. A traveler hoping for sweet pastries, eggs prepared to order, or a selection of fruit would have been disappointed. Efficiency mattered more than variety. The road was waiting. Many travelers preferred to begin walking while temperatures remained cool, especially during summer. Merchants wanted enough daylight to reach the next stopping place before darkness. Pilgrims measured progress in miles rather than comfort. Messengers carrying official letters often worked under strict deadlines established by rulers who were comfortably seated many miles away. Naturally, those rulers rarely experienced the muddy roads personally. One of history's quieter ironies is that the people issuing travel orders generally enjoyed considerably better accommodation than those carrying them. Still, even kings depended upon roads that were often unreliable. The condition of medieval roads varied enormously across Europe. Major Roman roads continued serving travelers centuries after the Roman Empire itself had faded in the West. Their stone foundations often remained remarkably durable, although maintenance became inconsistent in many regions. Elsewhere, roads consisted of little more than well-used dirt tracks winding between villages and fields. After heavy rain, these paths could transform into long stretches of mud. A fully loaded wagon might require several horses simply to move through particularly difficult sections. Travelers on foot often searched for patches of firmer ground beside the road, creating several parallel paths instead of one. Imagine a broad ribbon of churned earth marked by countless footprints, hoofprints, and wagon wheels. Every traveler added another layer. Every storm rearranged the surface again. Road maintenance, was usually the responsibility of local authorities, landowners, monasteries, or nearby communities. Results depended greatly upon local resources and enthusiasm. Some bridges received careful repairs. Others waited patiently for assistance that never quite arrived. Crossing rivers could become adventures in themselves. Stone bridges represented impressive engineering achievements and were treasured wherever they existed. Wooden bridges required continual maintenance and occasionally disappeared altogether after floods. In places without bridges, travelers relied on ferries or fords. A ford was simply a shallow section of river suitable for crossing. Suitable, however, did not necessarily mean convenient. Seasonal rains could transform an easy crossing into a dangerous obstacle within days. Travel therefore required flexibility. An experienced merchant seldom assumed that the shortest route would also be the quickest. Unexpected delays became ordinary companions. One flooded river, one broken wheel, one injured horse, one damaged bridge. Any of these could postpone an entire journey. Modern travelers sometimes become impatient when navigation software predicts an arrival 15 minutes later than expected. Medieval travelers measured delays rather differently. Arriving alive generally counted as being on schedule. As travelers left the inn behind, the surrounding countryside slowly awakened. Fields stretched across gentle hills where peasants had already begun working before sunrise. Oxen pulled heavy plows through rich soil. Shepherds guided sheep toward fresh grazing land. Smoke drifted upward from village chimneys as breakfast fires burned steadily inside modest cottages. Most of these villagers had little reason to travel far. Their lives revolved around seasonal rhythms that changed gradually year after year. Spring planting, summer labor, autumn harvest, winter repair. The road belonged more often to outsiders than locals. This made travelers noticeable. A merchant arriving from another kingdom might wear unfamiliar clothing, speak with a different accent, or carry unusual goods unavailable in nearby markets. Children often watched such visitors with open curiosity. Adults asked practical questions. Where had they come from? Were the roads safe? What prices were merchants paying elsewhere? Had there been war, disease? Good harvests? The medieval world contained surprisingly rich networks of information, despite lacking newspapers, telephones, or electronic communication. Travelers became living newspapers. Of course, newspapers have editors. Travelers did not. Stories occasionally improved themselves during long journeys. A small dispute between neighboring nobles might become an enormous civil war by the time it reached another province. A difficult winter became the coldest anyone had ever experienced. One unusually large wolf became an entire pack, terrorizing several counties. Human beings have always possessed remarkable confidence when repeating uncertain information. Because of course we do. This exchange of news made inns particularly valuable. Even travelers heading in opposite directions could benefit enormously from a brief evening conversation. A merchant traveling north might warn another about washed-out roads farther ahead. Pilgrims returning from distant shrines described conditions future pilgrims would soon encounter. Messengers quietly listened while pretending not to be interested. Knowledge reduced uncertainty. Never completely, but enough to matter. As the morning continued, let us pause beside one of the most important groups found on medieval roads: pilgrims. Religious pilgrimage occupied an enormous place in medieval society. People traveled to famous shrines for many reasons. Some hoped to fulfill religious vows. Others sought healing. Some gave thanks after surviving illness or danger. Others undertook pilgrimages as acts of penance. Popular destinations attracted visitors from astonishing distances. Canterbury in England, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Rome, Jerusalem, when political circumstances permitted. Countless regional shrines also welcomed local pilgrims throughout Europe. Pilgrims varied enormously in wealth. Some nobles traveled with servants, wagons, and considerable comfort. Many ordinary pilgrims walked. Their possessions fit inside small bags. Their clothing emphasized practicality over fashion. Wide-brimmed hats offered protection from sun and rain. Simple cloaks shielded against cold evenings. Walking staffs provided support during long days. Pilgrim badges collected from famous shrines served both as souvenirs and visible evidence of completed journeys. These badges fascinated contemporaries much as travelers today sometimes collect postcards or refrigerator magnets. Human habits remain surprisingly consistent. Only the souvenirs change. Pilgrims relied heavily upon hospitality. Monasteries frequently offered shelter. Some hospitals provided accommodation. Inns welcomed paying guests whenever space allowed. Charitable institutions existed partly because religious tradition encouraged care for travelers. Not every traveler encountered generosity, but enough did that these networks became essential parts of medieval travel. Monasteries deserve particular attention. Unlike ordinary inns, monasteries followed religious routines emphasizing order and hospitality. Guests usually experienced quieter evenings. Food remained simple but dependable. Sleeping arrangements could still be basic, yet discipline often produced cleaner surroundings than many commercial inns managed. Silence during certain hours was common. For exhausted travelers accustomed to crowded common rooms, such peace must have felt extraordinary. Although monastery rules varied considerably, not every monastery resembled another. Not every monk possessed identical enthusiasm for welcoming muddy strangers at sunset. Even saints appreciated advance notice. Meanwhile, commercial inns continued serving travelers whose destinations rarely aligned with monastery locations. Some developed excellent reputations over generations. Successful innkeeping required careful balance. Food had to remain affordable yet profitable. Beer required brewing. Supplies demanded constant replacement. Employees needed supervision. Stables required maintenance. Relationships with local authorities mattered. An innkeeper who consistently welcomed merchants encouraged commerce throughout the surrounding community. Market towns understood this well. A prosperous inn benefited everyone. Local farmers sold produce. Blacksmiths repaired horseshoes. Carpenters fixed wagons. Merchants spent money. Taxes eventually reached local rulers. Hospitality became surprisingly important economics. Occasionally, an inn grew famous, not because its beds were particularly comfortable. That remained optimistic. Instead, reputation developed through reliability. Travelers appreciated knowing what to expect. Clean food, reasonable prices, honest accounting, secure stables. These qualities generated loyal customers century after century. The professional innkeeper, if we may borrow one of our occasional historical nicknames, rarely became wealthy overnight. Success accumulated gradually through trust. Trust proved more valuable than impressive decorations. After all, painted walls could not prevent horses from escaping. Reliable stable doors could. Let us drift gently toward another small but revealing detail. Payment at inns did not always involve coins alone. Barter remained common in many regions. A merchant might exchange cloth. A craftsman offered repairs. Musicians occasionally entertained fellow guests in return for meals. Traveling physicians sometimes treated sick animals or injured people. Skills themselves possessed value. Money was useful. Practical ability often proved equally welcome. This flexibility reflected the broader medieval economy, where coinage circulated unevenly and local circumstances frequently shaped transactions. The road encouraged adaptation. Rigid expectations rarely lasted long. By midday, the travelers who had shared the previous night's crowded room might already be separated by many miles. Some followed rivers toward bustling cities. Others climbed mountain passes. Some entered dense forests where sunlight filtered through towering trees. Others crossed broad open plains where distant church towers marked the next village. Each landscape brought different challenges. Forests offered timber, game, and shelter. They also inspired stories. Medieval forests occupied an important place in imagination as well as geography. Legends spoke of outlaws, wandering knights, mysterious hermits, and supernatural beings. Reality proved somewhat less dramatic but still demanding. Dense woodland could confuse unfamiliar travelers. Roads became narrower. Visibility decreased. Fallen trees blocked paths after storms. Bandits occasionally took advantage of such conditions. Most forests, however, were simply forests. Beautiful, quiet, filled with birdsong. Home to hard-working woodcutters, hunters, charcoal burners, and communities whose daily lives depended upon woodland resources. History often becomes more interesting when ordinary reality replaces dramatic legend. The ordinary world, after all, contained more than enough challenges without adding dragons. As afternoon sunlight filtered through the leaves and the steady rhythm of footsteps continued along the winding road, the previous night's discomforts gradually faded into memory. Ahead, another village would eventually appear, another fire would be lit, and another inn would open its doors to weary strangers carrying stories, hopes, worries, and enough road dust to remind everyone that medieval travel was never truly clean, never especially comfortable, but somehow continued to connect an entire continent one difficult journey at a time. By late afternoon, the rhythm of travel often became more thoughtful than energetic. Even experienced travelers learned not to waste their strength during the brightest hours of the day. A merchant still had wagons to unload before sunset. A pilgrim hoped to reach shelter with enough energy left to prepare a simple meal, if no food was available. A messenger carrying royal correspondence might be under pressure to continue, but even the king's letters could not persuade an exhausted horse to ignore its own limits. Horses, in many respects, determined the pace of medieval Europe. A modern traveler might think first about roads, maps, or vehicles. Medieval people often thought first about animals. Horses carried riders, pulled wagons, transported goods, and delivered messages that connected kingdoms. Mules climbed difficult mountain paths with remarkable patience. Oxen, though slower, hauled heavy loads with dependable determination. Each animal required food, water, rest, and care. Ignoring these needs rarely ended well. An inn stable could therefore be almost as important as its sleeping rooms. Wealthy merchants sometimes worried more about the condition of their horses than the comfort of their own beds. A tired merchant could recover after one difficult night. An injured horse might delay an entire trading expedition. For this reason, a good stable hand earned genuine respect. Upon arriving at an inn, one of the first tasks was often tending to the animals before thinking about personal comfort. Saddles were removed, harnesses loosened, horses were rubbed down with straw or cloth to dry sweat from their coats after a long day's travel. Fresh water was provided carefully, as giving an overheated horse too much water too quickly was generally considered unwise. Hay and oats represented valuable fuel for the following day's journey. Travelers often inspected their animals for cuts, loose shoes, or signs of illness. A missing horseshoe discovered before sunset could sometimes be repaired by the village blacksmith. Discovering it halfway through the next day's journey was considerably less convenient. Naturally, timing had its own opinions. Blacksmiths occupied an essential place in medieval communities, and travelers frequently relied upon their skills. Shoes wore down surprisingly quickly on rough roads. Wagon wheels loosened. Metal fittings broke. Locks needed repair. A skilled smith could solve problems that might otherwise delay a journey for days. Their workshops became another source of local information. While waiting for repairs, travelers exchanged news much as they did in inns. The blacksmith, standing beside a glowing forge that attracted nearly everyone passing through the village, often knew an astonishing amount about local events. Not because the blacksmith traveled. Quite the opposite. Everyone else came to them. If medieval villages had unofficial information centers, the forge competed closely with the inn. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, another familiar calculation began. Would today's destination be reached before darkness? Experienced travelers tried to avoid unnecessary optimism. Distances on medieval roads could be deceptive. A village visible across a valley might still require hours to reach if the road wound through forests or followed rivers. Hills that appeared gentle from afar could become steep climbs beneath tired legs. There were no standardized road signs announcing that the next inn lay exactly 8 miles ahead. Instead, travelers asked local people, "How far is the next village?" The answer depended partly on geography. It also depended on whom one asked. An elderly farmer might describe the distance as about an hour. A young shepherd accustomed to climbing hills since childhood might confidently estimate just a short walk. A merchant leading heavily loaded wagons quietly suspected both estimates were optimistic. Human beings have always possessed wonderfully flexible ideas about distance. The roads themselves reflected centuries of continuous use. Some passed beneath ancient trees, whose branches shaded generations of travelers. Others crossed open farmland, where the changing seasons transformed the landscape entirely. During spring, wildflowers bordered the paths. Summer covered fields with ripening grain. Autumn painted forests in gold and deep red. Winter reduced familiar landmarks to quiet silhouettes beneath snow or frost. Every season brought advantages. Every season introduced fresh inconveniences. Winter travel could become especially difficult. Frozen ground sometimes improved muddy roads, allowing wagons to move more easily. Yet snow concealed hazards beneath its smooth surface. Rivers froze unpredictably. Mountain passes closed altogether. Short daylight hours reduced the distance travelers could safely cover. Cold itself presented constant challenges. Maintaining warmth required careful planning. Cloaks made from wool provided excellent insulation even when damp, which partly explains why wool remained such a valuable material throughout medieval Europe. Linen served well during warmer months, but offered little protection against freezing winds. Travelers layered clothing whenever possible. A typical traveler might wear a linen shirt beneath a wool tunic, with hose covering the legs and sturdy leather shoes or boots protecting the feet. Over this came a cloak fastened at the shoulder or neck with a simple brooch or pin. The cloak deserved special appreciation. It functioned as coat, blanket, pillow, rain cover, and occasionally an improvised bag. On particularly unpleasant evenings it attempted, with mixed success, to perform all these duties simultaneously. Fashion certainly existed during the Middle Ages, particularly among nobles and prosperous townspeople. Richly dyed fabrics, elaborate embroidery, fur linings, and carefully tailored garments displayed wealth and status. Travel, however, encouraged practicality. Even wealthy nobles often wore simpler clothing while on the road than they would inside their own halls. Mud possessed remarkably little respect for expensive fabrics. One unfortunate splash could undo hours of careful preparation. Road dust proved equally democratic. It settled happily upon silk and coarse wool alike. Let us drift gently toward another curious detail. Many medieval travelers carried small knives as everyday tools. Unlike modern pocket knives, these simple blades served dozens of ordinary purposes. They cut food, trimmed rope, repaired equipment, sharpened quills, prepared firewood, and assisted with countless daily tasks. Most people brought their own knife to meals, because inns did not always provide individual eating utensils. Forks, meanwhile, remained uncommon across much of medieval Europe for many centuries. Spoons existed, especially for soups and pottages, but fingers and knives handled much of the remaining work. Table manners certainly existed. They simply looked different from ours. Guests were expected to wash their hands before eating whenever water was available. Sharing dishes was common. Bread often served as both food and utensil. Thick slices, known today as trenchers, could support meat or stew during the meal before being eaten themselves or given to the poor, depending upon their condition. Dinner reflected local agriculture more than elaborate recipes. In northern regions, hearty stews dominated. Near rivers, fish appeared frequently. Coastal inns naturally relied upon seafood whenever catches allowed. Vegetables varied with the season. Herbs added flavor where available. Salt remained valuable because preserving food without refrigeration demanded considerable effort. Spices, imported through long-distance trade, represented luxuries that wealthier establishments might occasionally offer. Pepper traveled astonishing distances before reaching a medieval table. Its journey sometimes proved longer than that of the travelers sprinkling it onto their food. Trade connected worlds that many medieval people would never personally see. Silk from Asia, pepper from India, amber from the Baltic, wine from southern vineyards, wool from English pastures. Each product passed through countless hands before reaching its destination. Merchants who stayed in medieval inns helped make these exchanges possible. They accepted difficult roads because the rewards justified the effort. Of course, not every merchant became prosperous. Storms sank ships. Bandits attacked caravans. Markets fluctuated. Kings occasionally imposed new taxes with great enthusiasm and limited consultation. The professional tax collector seldom appeared in popular songs. Meanwhile, travelers continued arriving at inns, carrying goods that represented months of careful planning. Bales of cloth, barrels of wine, bundles of furs, wax, leather, metal tools, books copied painstakingly by hand. Each item held value far beyond its physical weight. Books deserve a brief pause. A single manuscript could require months or even years to produce. Before the printing press transformed Europe in the 15th century, every book was copied by hand. Monks, professional scribes, and educated clerks worked patiently, forming each letter with careful precision. Transporting books demanded caution. Rain threatened ink. Rough handling damaged bindings. Theft remained a concern because some manuscripts cost more than modest houses. An educated traveler carrying several volumes might attract considerable attention. Knowledge itself traveled slowly. Every journey helped spread it a little farther. Universities in places such as Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and Cambridge drew students from remarkable distances. Young scholars endured the same muddy roads, crowded inns, and uncertain whether as merchants and pilgrims. Student life possessed its own complications. Many medieval students were far younger than modern university students. Some lived with very limited financial resources. Others gained reputations for enthusiastic celebrations that occasionally tested the patience of local authorities. Apparently, higher education has always inspired at least a little chaos. Even so, universities became centers where ideas moved across Europe with surprising speed. A lecture heard in Italy might influence scholars in England within a generation. Travel made this possible. As afternoon slowly surrendered to evening once again, another inn appeared beside the road. Its timber frame leaned ever so slightly, suggesting that time had been conducting quiet negotiations with gravity for several decades. Smoke rose from the chimney. A stable stood nearby. Several wagons already waited outside. The familiar routine would soon begin again. Animals first, food second, sleep if fortune allowed. The faces inside would be different from those of the previous evening, yet the conversations would follow recognizable patterns. Where are you headed? How are the roads? Has anyone heard news from the capital? Is the bridge beyond the river still standing? Has the plague reached that town? What price is wool fetching this season? One evening's companions became tomorrow's memories. Still, these brief encounters quietly stitched together the medieval world. Without realizing it, travelers carried more than goods. They carried stories, rumors, songs, prayers, recipes, business practices, languages, ideas. Every road functioned as a thread, and every inn served as one of the knots holding that vast network together. It was rarely comfortable. It was often inconvenient. Yet despite the mud, crowded beds, smoky rooms, and determined bedbugs, medieval inns remained among the most important institutions of everyday travel. They offered something precious that could not easily be measured in coins alone, a temporary place of safety in an uncertain world, where strangers shared firelight for a single evening before quietly disappearing toward different horizons with the coming dawn. With another night safely behind them, the travelers who had gathered beneath the inn's roof slowly dispersed once again. The merchant adjusted the straps securing his bales of cloth. A pair of pilgrims tightened their worn sandals before lifting their walking staffs. A royal messenger checked the leather case containing sealed documents with the same care he had shown the previous evening. Somewhere in the stable, a horse expressed its opinion about the early hour with a patient but unmistakably unhappy snort. The road accepted them all without ceremony. Unlike castles, cathedrals, or great market squares, roads did not distinguish between rich and poor. Kings traveled them with glittering processions. Beggars walked them alone. Monks, scholars, craftsmen, entertainers, soldiers, and farmers all left footprints on the same earth. The experience, however, differed greatly depending on one's wealth. A prosperous noble rarely traveled alone. Even a relatively minor lord often moved with servants, mounted guards, cooks, clerks, and enough wagons to resemble a moving household. Noble families did not simply visit another estate carrying a small satchel and an extra pair of stockings. They brought much of their daily life with them. Furniture occasionally accompanied long journeys. Chests filled with clothing, silver tableware, valuable documents, hunting equipment, and household supplies traveled from one residence to another. Wealth in the medieval world was often visible because it had to be physically transported. Managing such a procession demanded careful planning. Every additional wagon increased the likelihood of broken wheels. Every extra horse required more feed. Every servant needed food and somewhere to sleep. An innkeeper who welcomed a noble household suddenly faced the challenge of accommodating perhaps 30 or 40 unexpected guests. This explains why larger towns often developed several inns rather than relying on one. Even then, important visitors sometimes occupied nearly every available bed. Ordinary travelers arriving later in the evening might discover that the finest rooms had already been claimed, leaving only crowded sleeping areas or space in nearby barns. Status certainly mattered, but timing mattered as well. The medieval road rewarded those who arrived before everyone else. For travelers with fewer resources, every coin required careful thought. A merchant calculated whether paying for a better room justified the expense. A pilgrim considered whether a monastery offering free lodging lay only a few more miles ahead. Craftsmen traveling in search of work often shared costs whenever possible. Partnership reduced expenses. It also made journeys safer. Groups naturally attracted less attention from thieves than solitary travelers. Companionship provided practical advantages beyond security. Someone could watch the horses while another purchased supplies. One traveler might negotiate with the innkeeper while another unloaded baggage. Shared knowledge proved equally valuable. A merchant familiar with northern trade routes could advise companions heading that direction for the first time. Pilgrims who had already completed part of a famous route often knew which villages welcomed strangers warmly, and which places charged rather ambitious prices for remarkably ordinary meals. Experience traveled from person to person. No written guidebook could entirely replace it. There were, of course, maps. But medieval maps served different purposes from modern road atlases. Many surviving medieval maps emphasized religious understanding, important cities, or symbolic representations of the known world, rather than precise measurements for travelers. Practical route information often came through written itineraries instead. An itinerary might list towns in sequence, allowing travelers to follow established stopping places rather than measuring exact distances. Such instructions were surprisingly effective. If one knew the next village and the village beyond that, the journey gradually unfolded one familiar stop at a time. It resembled following a chain of memories rather than a carefully measured line. Local knowledge filled the remaining gaps. One of the quieter skills developed by experienced travelers was learning to observe the landscape itself. The position of the sun, the direction of rivers, the condition of roads, the appearance of villages, smoke rising in the distance, church towers visible across fields. These small details helped travelers judge where they were and how much farther remained before shelter became available. Weather demanded equal attention. Dark clouds gathering during the afternoon could change travel plans immediately. A heavy storm transformed roads into deep mud within hours. Small streams became swift obstacles. Wagons slowed dramatically. Cloaks, no matter how carefully woven, eventually surrendered to persistent rain. There was no waterproof fabric waiting quietly inside a backpack. Instead, travelers accepted damp clothing as one of the ordinary inconveniences of life on the road. Wool retained warmth surprisingly well even after becoming wet, making it one of the most practical materials available. Linen dried relatively quickly during warm weather, but offered less insulation when temperatures dropped. Those fortunate enough to own several changes of clothing protected them carefully inside waxed cloth or leather bags whenever possible. Dry garments represented extraordinary comfort after a rainy day. Sometimes luxury meant nothing more complicated than socks that were no longer wet. As one problem slowly faded, another quietly appeared: shoes. Footwear received astonishing punishment during medieval travel. Most ordinary shoes were made from leather and constructed by skilled cobblers who understood local conditions well. Yet even excellent craftsmanship struggled against endless miles of rough roads, rocky paths, and muddy fields. Leather cracked. Soles wore thin. Stitching loosened. A traveler whose shoes failed completely faced serious difficulty. Walking barefoot across medieval roads was not merely uncomfortable. It was dangerous. Sharp stones, broken branches, discarded metal, and countless other hazards covered the ground. Maintaining footwear, therefore, became an essential part of preparing for long journeys. Cobblers found steady work in market towns because there was never any shortage of worn boots requiring attention. Modern travelers sometimes purchased souvenirs while on holiday. Medieval travelers often purchased replacement footwear. Far less glamorous, considerably more useful. Let us drift gently toward another curious detail. Many inns displayed signs, not only because many customers could not read, but also because the signs became memorable landmarks in spoken directions. Instead of saying, "Turn left after number 23 High Street," someone might explain, "Continue until you reach the Golden Heart, then cross the bridge." The sign itself became part of the geography. Some inns maintained the same names for generations, creating recognizable waypoints that appeared in legal records, business agreements, and travelers' accounts. Their painted animals and symbols quietly became part of the local landscape. The accuracy of those paintings remained wonderfully inconsistent. One man's majestic eagle occasionally looked suspiciously like another man's determined goose. Artistic enthusiasm sometimes exceeded artistic precision. Fortunately, most travelers understood the intention. As the day progressed, roads gradually became busier near important market towns. These settlements formed the commercial heartbeat of medieval regions. Farmers arrived carrying vegetables, grain, eggs, butter, cheese, and livestock. Craftsmen displayed tools, pottery, shoes, cloth, candles, and wooden household goods. Merchants unloaded imported products unavailable in nearby villages. The market itself became a meeting place where business, gossip, entertainment, and local politics blended together. For an innkeeper, market days were often excellent news. Visitors required meals. Animals needed stabling. Some merchants remained overnight before beginning the return journey. Business flourished whenever roads brought people together. Not every visitor came to trade. Traveling entertainers also appeared regularly. Musicians carrying simple instruments. Storytellers with remarkably good memories. Jugglers, acrobats. Occasionally trained animals performed tricks that delighted children and skeptical adults alike. Entertainment provided welcome relief after long hours of labor. An inn fortunate enough to host a talented performer often filled quickly. Ale tasted much the same. Stories improved noticeably. Human beings have always appreciated ending difficult days with shared laughter, even when tomorrow promised another 20 miles of muddy road. Some entertainers carried news almost as valuable as merchants did. Their performances often included tales gathered from distant regions. While the details occasionally expanded during repeated retellings, they nevertheless introduced audiences to places they might never personally visit. The medieval imagination traveled farther than most medieval feet. Meanwhile, in the kitchens behind the common room, another familiar routine unfolded. Cooking for travelers required efficiency above all else. Large iron cauldrons simmered above open fires. Bread baked in batches. Meat, when available, had to be used before spoilage. Vegetables reflected the season. Nothing could be wasted casually. Food represented labor. Every loaf of bread embodied months of planting, harvesting, milling, kneading, and baking. Every piece of cheese reflected careful management of livestock. Even humble onions required time to grow. Medieval cooks understood economy remarkably well because they had little alternative. Modern kitchens often rely on refrigeration. Medieval kitchens relied upon experience, salting, smoking, drying, pickling, fermenting. These techniques extended the usefulness of food supplies through changing seasons. An experienced innkeeper knew exactly how much grain remained in storage, how many barrels of ale were available, and whether another pig would need to be slaughtered before the coming market day. Running an inn required careful mathematics long before calculators existed. Mistakes became expensive quickly. The successful innkeeper, another quiet member of our growing collection of historical nicknames, rarely attracted attention by doing anything extraordinary. Instead, success came from hundreds of ordinary decisions made consistently well. Buying supplies at sensible prices, keeping the stable clean enough to encourage returning customers, treating guests fairly, knowing when to settle arguments before they became fights, remembering familiar faces, offering honest advice about road conditions. Reputation accumulated slowly. It could disappear remarkably fast. A dishonest innkeeper might profit from one evening. A trustworthy innkeeper earned business for decades. As evening approached once again, travelers began watching the horizon with practiced eyes. Another day's journey had almost ended. The familiar hope quietly returned. May there be room at the next inn. May the roof not leak too badly. May the food be warm. May the bedbugs be fewer than last night. History suggests that the final wish was often the most ambitious of them all. Still, hope has always traveled surprisingly well alongside human beings. Even after exhausting roads, uncertain weather, aching feet, and cramped sleeping quarters, people continued setting out each morning because trade continued, pilgrimages continued, kingdoms continued, and life itself continued to move one careful mile at a time across the dusty roads of medieval Europe. The longer someone spent traveling in the medieval world, the more they began to recognize that every region possessed its own quiet personality. The roads might be equally muddy, the inns equally crowded, and the beds equally uncertain, yet each landscape revealed subtle differences that became familiar to experienced travelers. In northern Europe, dense forests often stretched for miles, interrupted by scattered villages where timber framed nearly every building. Roofs were steep to shed winter snow, and smoke drifted from broad chimneys that worked steadily through much of the year. Travelers passing through these settlements might notice the sharp scent of freshly cut wood, the steady rhythm of axes echoing from nearby forests, and wagons piled high with logs destined for distant towns. Farther south, the scenery slowly changed. Stone buildings became more common. Olive groves replaced some forests. Vineyards covered gentle hillsides. The evening meal might include different herbs, different bread, and different wine, yet the traveler still searched for exactly the same thing as everywhere else: a secure place to sleep. The medieval inn adapted to local customs remarkably well. An inn in England rarely looked identical to one in northern Italy. Buildings reflected available materials, climate, and local building traditions. Timber dominated where forests were plentiful. Stone appeared where quarries stood nearby. Roofs might be covered with thatch, wooden shingles, slate, or clay tiles depending on geography and wealth. Despite these differences, a weary traveler usually recognized an inn almost immediately. The stable stood close by. Smoke rose from the kitchen. Voices drifted through open doors. Someone was almost certainly arguing over the price of something. Commerce has always been wonderfully consistent. Negotiation occupied a surprising amount of daily life. Unlike modern hotels with printed rates displayed at reception, prices in medieval inns often depended upon circumstances. How busy was the inn? How wealthy did the traveler appear? How many horses required stabling? How long would the guest remain? Would meals be included? Could payment be made immediately? Experienced travelers understood that politeness and patience often reduced expenses more effectively than loud complaints. This remains useful advice in many situations. The innkeeper, meanwhile, developed impressive instincts. Years spent greeting strangers allowed many to estimate a guest's means within moments. Clothing provided clues. The quality of leather boots. The condition of cloaks. The number of servants. The equipment carried. Even the horse itself revealed much about its owner. A fine warhorse suggested nobility or military service. A sturdy pack mule pointed toward commerce. A tired donkey carrying baskets usually announced humbler circumstances. Appearances, however, occasionally deceived. Some wealthy merchants dressed modestly while traveling specifically to avoid attracting attention. Certain nobles preferred practical clothing on difficult roads. Others insisted upon displaying every possible sign of status, regardless of weather, mud, or common sense. History contains no shortage of people determined to remain fashionable under thoroughly impractical conditions. Mud rarely admired their efforts. As evening settled over another roadside inn, conversation naturally turned toward recent events. The medieval world often feels distant to us, yet many topics discussed around those wooden tables remain surprisingly familiar. The harvest, taxes. Road repairs, prices. Political uncertainty. The weather. Whether someone important had made another questionable decision. Human conversation has displayed remarkable continuity across the centuries. One traveler described unusually heavy rains that delayed grain shipments. Another mentioned rumors of conflict between neighboring lords. A merchant complained that bridge tolls seemed higher than the previous year. A pilgrim quietly observed that every shrine appeared to sell slightly more souvenirs than seemed strictly necessary. Commercial opportunity has always possessed a healthy imagination. These conversations carried practical value. Markets depended upon information. Suppose a cloth merchant learned that poor harvests had reduced wool production in a neighboring region. Prices might soon rise. Suppose another heard that a major bridge had collapsed. Choosing an alternative route could save several days. Knowledge often weighed nothing, yet it could prove more valuable than an entire wagon of merchandise. One of the most respected travelers inside many inns was not necessarily the richest. It was the most experienced. Someone who had crossed mountain passes repeatedly. Someone who understood seasonal floods. Someone who knew which ferrymen were honest and which preferred rather imaginative pricing. Experience accumulated slowly, one journey after another. Unlike expensive clothing, it could not be stolen easily. Let us drift gently toward another curious detail. Candles were valuable enough that many inns used them sparingly. Good beeswax candles burned cleanly, but cost considerably more than tallow candles made from animal fat. Tallow candles were cheaper and therefore common in ordinary establishments, though they produced more smoke and a distinctive smell that few modern people would describe as pleasant. Because artificial light remained expensive, medieval evenings often ended earlier than ours. People adjusted their lives to daylight. Once darkness settled fully, there was little practical reason to remain awake unless work demanded it. The fire became the center of attention. Stories replaced activity. Gradually, sleep followed. This daily rhythm influenced nearly every aspect of medieval society. Long before alarm clocks and electric lighting, sunrise quietly governed the beginning of work while sunset encouraged rest. There were exceptions, of course. Night watchmen guarded city gates. Monks observed nighttime prayers according to their religious schedules. Bakers often worked before dawn, so fresh bread would be ready by morning. Blacksmiths occasionally completed urgent repairs late into the evening. Still, most travelers appreciated every hour of sleep they could obtain. Unfortunately, sleep itself remained uncertain. The sounds of a medieval inn formed their own peculiar orchestra. Logs settled in the fireplace with gentle cracks. Rain tapped steadily against wooden shutters. Wind slipped through tiny gaps in the walls. Somewhere nearby, horses shifted within their stalls. A dog barked once before deciding the effort was unnecessary. Someone coughed. Someone else snored with astonishing determination. Occasionally, an infant reminded the entire building that personal schedules were entirely negotiable. Modern hotels advertised soundproof rooms. Medieval inns advertised roofs. Expectations differed. Yet within this constant background of noise, many travelers managed to sleep surprisingly well. Exhaustion proved remarkably effective. After walking 20 miles carrying supplies, the human body becomes considerably less interested in ideal sleeping conditions. Comfort remained welcome. Fatigue remained persuasive. The innkeeper's responsibilities continued long after guests settled for the night. Kitchen fires required attention. Doors remained secured. Animals occasionally needed care. Late arrivals sometimes knocked unexpectedly, hoping for shelter despite the advanced hour. Deciding whether to admit them involved balancing compassion with caution. A genuine traveler might desperately need protection from bad weather. A criminal might also claim to be a genuine traveler. Judgment mattered. Some innkeepers gained reputations for generosity. Others preferred strict rules. Neither approach guaranteed success. Hospitality itself occupied an important place within medieval culture. Religious teachings across Europe encouraged helping travelers, especially pilgrims and the poor. Noble households often considered generous hospitality part of honorable behavior. Monasteries welcomed many visitors as part of their religious duty. Commercial inns existed for profit. Yet even there, hospitality remained essential. A traveler who felt cheated rarely returned. More importantly, they told others. Reputation traveled faster than wagons. A single dishonest transaction might eventually reach merchants hundreds of miles away through ordinary conversation. The medieval economy relied heavily upon trust built over repeated encounters. Written contracts certainly existed. Personal reputation often mattered just as much. Meanwhile, beyond the walls of the inn, countless villages settled into evening routines of their own. Church bells marked the passing hours. Families gathered around simple meals. Animals were brought safely into barns. Village streets gradually emptied. Without artificial lighting, darkness transformed familiar places into quiet landscapes where only moonlight and scattered lanterns interrupted the night. It is easy to imagine medieval Europe as constantly noisy because of bustling markets and crowded castles. In truth, much of it became extraordinarily quiet after sunset. Away from towns, travelers heard little beyond wind moving through trees, distant owls, flowing streams, or the occasional howl of wolves in regions where they still lived. The silence itself could feel immense. Someone raised in a modern city might find such darkness almost unsettling. A medieval villager regarded it as entirely ordinary. Our relationship with nighttime has changed dramatically. Centuries ago, darkness was accepted. Today, we often attempt to eliminate it. As one problem slowly faded, another quietly appeared for many travelers: illness. Long journeys placed considerable strain on the body. Poor weather, limited nutrition, physical exhaustion, minor injuries, crowded sleeping conditions. Any of these could weaken even healthy individuals. A simple blister might become infected. An untreated cough could linger for weeks. Digestive illnesses spread easily wherever large numbers of people shared food, water, and living space. Medical knowledge reflected the understanding of the period. Physicians, surgeons, apothecaries, monks, herbal healers, and local wise women all contributed different forms of care depending on place and circumstance. Some treatments proved genuinely useful. Others offered comfort more than cure. Many rested upon the ancient theory of balancing the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which dominated European medicine for centuries. Modern science has replaced these ideas, yet they shaped medical practice throughout much of medieval history. Travelers carried simple remedies whenever possible: herbs, bandages, ointments, perhaps a small supply of vinegar for cleaning wounds or preserving food. Prepared individuals generally fared better than optimistic ones. This principle extends comfortably beyond the Middle Ages. The remarkable thing is not that medieval travel was difficult. It certainly was. The remarkable thing is how effectively people adapted to those difficulties. Networks of inns developed. Merchants formed partnerships. Pilgrims traveled together. Communities repaired bridges. Monasteries opened their doors. Local knowledge passed patiently from one traveler to another. Bit by bit, generation after generation, Europe remained connected despite every inconvenience the roads could produce. And so, as another fire burned low beneath blackened beams and weary guests wrapped themselves in rough wool blankets, the familiar routine quietly repeated itself. Outside, the road disappeared into darkness once more, waiting patiently for dawn to bring another procession of merchants, pilgrims, scholars, messengers, nobles, and ordinary people whose lives would intersect for just one evening before drifting apart again beneath the endless medieval sky. By the high Middle Ages, the network of roads crossing Europe had become far busier than many people imagine today. Medieval life is often pictured as isolated villages surrounded by endless wilderness, each community existing almost entirely on its own. While many villages were indeed small and self-contained, the major roads connecting kingdoms rarely remained empty for long. At almost any time of year, someone was traveling. A merchant guided a wagon filled with Flemish cloth toward a growing market town. A bishop journeyed to attend a church council. Stonemasons followed opportunities wherever great cathedrals were under construction. Seasonal laborers searched for work during harvest. Royal officials carried tax records between administrative centers. Students left home for universities that promised education, unavailable anywhere nearby. Every traveler had a reason for accepting uncomfortable beds, muddy roads, uncertain weather, and the occasional conversation with complete strangers who snored like collapsing castle walls. The inn became the place where these different lives briefly crossed. Imagine entering the common room shortly after sunset. Near the fireplace sits an elderly merchant who has spent more than 30 years following the same trade routes. His boots have been repaired so many times that very little of the original leather remains visible. Across from him sits a young student on his first long journey away from home. His satchel contains carefully copied notes, a few treasured books, and just enough money to reach the university if nothing unexpected happens. Nearby, two pilgrims quietly discuss the final stage of their journey to a famous shrine. A blacksmith traveling to another town for seasonal work carefully oils his tools before bed. None of them belong to the same social world. Yet for one evening they share food, warmth, conversation, and whatever sleeping space remains available. This temporary community formed one of medieval Europe's most remarkable social institutions. Outside an inn, rank and status still mattered enormously. Inside, practical concerns often softened those distinctions, at least for a little while. Everyone wanted dry boots. Everyone appreciated warm soup. Everyone hoped the roof would survive the night's weather. Even noble travelers occasionally found themselves waiting beside ordinary merchants, while horses were watered or wagons repaired. Reality possesses an impressive ability to ignore social ceremony. This did not mean medieval society became suddenly equal. Far from it. The best rooms still went to those who could afford them. Servants often slept separately from their masters. Wealth purchased privacy whenever privacy existed. Nevertheless, the road forced different groups into closer contact than daily life inside villages or castles usually allowed. One consequence was the constant exchange of ideas. Languages mixed. Accents blended. Regional customs spread gradually from place to place. Recipes traveled. Songs wandered astonishing distances. Even styles of clothing slowly influenced neighboring regions, as merchants introduced new fabrics and fashions. Cultural change rarely arrived all at once. More often it arrived one traveler at a time. One particularly interesting group found in medieval inns consisted of craftsmen moving between large building projects. Europe's great cathedrals required generations to complete. Some construction lasted 50, 100, or even 200 years. No single builder witnessed the entire process. Instead, skilled workers traveled wherever opportunities appeared. Master masons, stone carvers, glaziers, carpenters, roofers, bell founders. Each possessed specialized knowledge developed through years of apprenticeship. Their movement helped spread architectural techniques across Europe. A stone carving style developed in France might gradually influence churches in England. Engineering solutions devised in one city appeared elsewhere decades later. Knowledge traveled inside people's memories, long before it appeared in printed books. The medieval inn quietly supported this exchange. A mason rested there before beginning work at another cathedral. A carpenter shared stories from distant towns. An apprentice listened carefully, learning almost as much during evening conversations as during formal instruction. Learning did not occur only in classrooms. It occurred around fireplaces as well. Let us drift gently toward another curious detail. Many inns brewed their own ale. Brewing formed an ordinary part of household management throughout much of medieval Europe. Because water quality varied from place to place, weak ale became a common daily drink for adults and children alike. Brewing required grain, clean equipment, careful timing, and practical experience rather than mysterious secrets. Every innkeeper hoped the latest batch would be remembered for its flavor, rather than for unfortunate digestive consequences. Success was never entirely guaranteed. Food safety presented continual challenges. Without refrigeration, preserving ingredients demanded constant attention. Meat had to be used quickly or preserved through salting or smoking. Milk spoiled rapidly. Fish remained freshest near rivers and coastlines. Fresh vegetables followed seasonal availability. An experienced cook relied heavily upon observation. The smell of food, its texture, its appearance. Centuries before laboratory testing existed, survival encouraged careful habits. The result was not perfect, but it was often better than modern stereotypes suggest. Medieval people generally understood spoiled food was dangerous. They simply lacked our scientific explanations for why. As evening conversations continued, stories naturally grew more elaborate. Travel encourages storytelling. Always has. A merchant described crossing an alpine pass during an unexpected snowstorm. A sailor recalled rough seas in the English Channel. A pilgrim spoke quietly about reaching Rome after months on the road. Not every tale was entirely accurate. Memory has always been a creative editor. Distance improves many stories. So does time. The old merchant by the fire probably had climbed that hill. Whether it had truly become steeper with each retelling remains open to discussion. Because of course it did. Children especially enjoyed hearing travelers' accounts. In villages where few people journeyed far from home, distant cities seemed almost unbelievable. Paris, Venice, Constantinople. Each possessed its own reputation. Some were known for learning, others for commerce, some for magnificent churches, others for complicated politics that could occupy several evenings of conversation without reaching any firm conclusions. Human governments have always shown remarkable enthusiasm for complexity. Meanwhile, weather remained the great equalizer. A violent storm ignored titles. Heavy rain treated bishops and bakers with identical indifference. Strong winds overturned expensive wagons just as effectively as ordinary carts. Many travelers learned patience because nature rarely accepted complaints. One flooded bridge could delay dozens of people simultaneously. The resulting gathering sometimes transformed a quiet roadside inn into an unexpectedly lively meeting place. Merchants waited. Pilgrims rested. Messengers grew increasingly anxious. Innkeepers quietly appreciated the additional customers. Someone's inconvenience became someone else's successful business day. On the royal misery scale, being trapped for 3 extra days because a river refused to cooperate earns a comfortable 8 out of 10. Unless the inn happened to serve particularly good bread. Then perhaps the score falls slightly, not much, but slightly. While roads connected distant places, cities themselves offered another world entirely. Entering a medieval city after days of rural travel overwhelmed the senses. Stone walls rose ahead. Church bells echoed above crowded streets. Market stalls overflowed with goods from many regions. Blacksmiths hammered glowing iron. Bakers filled the air with the smell of fresh bread. Tanners, unfortunately, contributed rather different aromas. Every medieval city possessed districts associated with particular trades. Leather workers often occupied areas downstream because tanning produced exceptionally strong smells. Brewers clustered together. Metal workers gathered where workshops could share supplies. Visitors quickly discovered that cities organized themselves through practical necessity rather than modern urban planning. Inns inside cities reflected this greater activity. Larger establishments served merchants conducting substantial business. Some specialized in particular groups of travelers. Others developed reputations connected with specific trade routes. Competition encouraged higher standards in prosperous commercial centers. Not luxury by modern expectations. Merely fewer unpleasant surprises. That alone represented meaningful progress. City authorities sometimes regulated inns carefully. Prices. Measures of ale. Standards for food. Responsibilities toward guests. Officials recognized that visiting merchants contributed significantly to local prosperity. Mistreating travelers damaged business. Protecting them encouraged future trade. Law and economics occasionally cooperated surprisingly well. Nightfall inside city walls differed from the countryside. Gates eventually closed. Watchmen patrolled streets. Curfews existed in many places. Lanterns glowed faintly through windows. Yet darkness remained far deeper than anything familiar to modern urban life. A traveler standing beside an upper window might see only scattered points of light stretching across the town. Beyond the walls lay almost complete darkness. The stars appeared astonishingly bright. Without electric lights competing overhead, the night sky revealed itself with extraordinary clarity. Travelers who spent weeks crossing open countryside became familiar companions of the constellations. They offered beauty, occasionally guidance, always perspective. Generations looked upward and saw much the same heavens: kings, peasants, pilgrims, merchants, students, all traveled beneath identical stars. And as another evening slowly settled across the roads of medieval Europe, the fires inside countless inns flickered gently against timber walls. Travelers loosened tired boots, thanked weary horses with one final handful of hay, accepted another bowl of warm pottage, and prepared once more for a night that would likely be noisy, crowded, imperfect, and, by the standards of the age, perfectly ordinary. As the seasons turned, the medieval roads changed with them, but the inns remained faithful landmarks for those who spent their lives in motion. A traveler might forget the exact date of a particular journey, or the names of every village passed along the way, yet they often remembered the inns. There was the one beside the old stone bridge, where the owner kept remarkably friendly sheep that wandered into the courtyard, whenever the gate was left open. There was another where the roof leaked directly above the warmest place near the fire, forcing guests to choose between comfort and remaining dry. There was the inn whose cook somehow managed to produce excellent bread every morning, despite working with an oven that looked older than several kingdoms. And there was always at least one establishment whose bed seemed to contain enough bedbugs to establish a thriving medieval republic. Experienced travelers developed favorites. Whenever possible, they planned their journeys around places whose owners they trusted. Returning to a familiar inn brought a quiet sense of relief. The innkeeper might remember their name. A stable hand recognized the horse. A familiar bench beside the hearth waited where it had always stood. For people whose lives involved constant movement, these small moments of recognition offered an unexpected feeling of belonging. Hospitality, after all, is not measured only by the quality of a meal. It is also measured by familiarity. A warm greeting after several weeks on muddy roads could feel almost as valuable as a soft bed. Almost. Not quite. Soft beds remained difficult to surpass. The regular travelers slowly became known to one another as well. Merchants using the same trade routes often crossed paths several times each year. They exchanged information about changing prices, new tolls, damaged bridges, and political developments that might affect business. Competition certainly existed. So did cooperation. When a wagon became trapped in deep mud, nearby merchants frequently helped free it. Tomorrow, they reasoned, the same assistance might be needed in return. Practical generosity often grew from practical necessity. Pilgrims formed similar relationships. Long religious journeys created temporary communities that lasted weeks or months. People who had been strangers at the beginning of a pilgrimage gradually learned one another's habits. Who woke earliest? Who walked fastest? Who carried extra bandages? Who knew useful prayers? Who somehow always managed to locate the nearest bakery? Every group quietly developed its own rhythm. Meanwhile, medieval innkeepers watched generations pass through their doors. Children who first arrived holding a parent's hand sometimes returned years later as independent merchants. Young apprentices became respected craftsmen. Students eventually traveled as professors or church officials. Some familiar faces simply stopped appearing, their journeys completed elsewhere. The innkeeper rarely knew every reason. Life on the road carried uncertainties that no careful planning could completely remove. Disease, accidents, conflict, harsh weather, and simple old age eventually ended every traveler's final journey. Yet the road itself continued. New faces replaced old ones. Fresh stories took the place of familiar tales. The fire was lit again each evening. Bread was baked once more. Another horse required a stable. Another stranger needed a place to sleep. This quiet continuity formed part of the rhythm of medieval life. Let us drift gently toward another small but revealing detail. Many travelers carried religious objects during their journeys. Some wore small crosses. Others kept relic badges obtained during pilgrimages. Written prayers, carefully folded into tiny packets, occasionally accompanied travelers who believed they offered protection. These objects reflected sincere faith rather than superstition in the eyes of those who carried them. Travel involved genuine risks, and seeking spiritual comfort alongside practical preparation felt entirely natural. A careful traveler packed food, spare clothing, and hope in roughly equal proportions. Religion also shaped the calendar itself. Major feast days influenced travel plans. Markets often coincided with religious festivals. Pilgrims timed departures according to important celebrations. Even ordinary travelers sometimes delayed journeys to attend local church services before setting out. The rhythm of medieval travel followed both the seasons and the religious year. Time itself was experienced differently. Without pocket watches or mobile phones, people measured days through church bells, sunlight, meals, and familiar routines. An innkeeper knew breakfast should begin as dawn approached. Travelers recognized when evening shadows suggested it was time to search for shelter. The sky served as everyone's clock. Clouds occasionally made that clock rather difficult to read. Nature accepted no complaints. As one problem slowly faded, another quietly appeared. Road maintenance. The sheer number of people, animals, and wagons using important routes gradually damaged them. Deep ruts formed where heavy wheels repeatedly followed the same path. Rainwater collected inside these depressions, making them deeper with each passing season. Bridges required constant repair. Wood rotted. Stone loosened. Floods ignored expensive construction projects with admirable impartiality. Communities invested enormous effort simply keeping roads usable. They rarely succeeded perfectly. Still, they continued trying. There is something quietly admirable about this persistence. Generation after generation repaired bridges that future floods might damage again. They filled potholes that next winter would reopen. They cleared fallen trees after storms, knowing more storms would eventually arrive. Maintenance rarely receives much attention in history books. Yet civilizations depend upon it. Without countless unnamed laborers repairing roads, cleaning wells, rebuilding bridges, and maintaining inns, merchants could not trade, pilgrims could not travel, armies could not march, and rulers could not govern distant lands effectively. History often celebrates kings. Roads remember carpenters. The same is true of innkeepers. Few became famous beyond their local communities. Yet they quietly supported nearly every important journey taking place around them. Royal messengers, foreign ambassadors, traveling physicians, scholars carrying newly copied manuscripts, builders constructing magnificent cathedrals, ordinary families searching for work, all passed beneath roofs maintained by people whose names have mostly disappeared from the historical record. The work itself remained. Perhaps that is one of history's gentlest lessons. Not every important contribution receives a monument. Some simply provide warm food to tired strangers. The physical appearance of inns also evolved gradually across the centuries. As towns became wealthier through commerce, larger inns appeared along major trade routes. Some offered separate rooms more frequently. Others improved stable to accommodate growing numbers of horses. Stone gradually replaced timber in certain prosperous regions, reducing the danger of devastating fires. Glass windows became more common among wealthier establishments, although many ordinary inns continued relying upon wooden shutters for generations. Comfort improved slowly. Very slowly. The bedbugs, unfortunately, displayed remarkable determination. They adapted with impressive confidence. History occasionally rewards persistence for reasons nobody requested. Medical understanding also advanced little by little. Better sanitation practices appeared in some places. Cities introduced regulations concerning waste disposal. Water systems improved where resources permitted. None of these developments happened overnight. Progress generally arrived in modest steps rather than dramatic leaps. A traveler visiting the same route 20 years apart might notice small improvements. A repaired bridge, a larger stable, a cleaner kitchen, better paving near the town gates. Civilization often advances through quiet maintenance rather than spectacular invention. By now, our imaginary traveler has spent many weeks crossing medieval Europe. Their boots have collected dust from forests, valleys, mountains, and market squares. Their cloak smells faintly of wood smoke after countless evenings beside in fireplaces. They have learned to inspect mattresses before lying down whenever possible. They have discovered that arriving before sunset greatly improves the chances of finding decent accommodation. They know which villages bake particularly good bread. They understand that weather forecasts provided by elderly shepherds are occasionally more reliable than excessive confidence. Experience has become their greatest companion. On the royal misery scale, medieval travel as a whole probably settles around a generous 8 out of 10. It demanded patience, endurance, adaptability, and a willingness to accept that perfect comfort simply was not part of the bargain. Yet millions of people still traveled. Trade expanded. Universities flourished. Pilgrimages connected distant communities. Ideas crossed borders. Books moved from monastery to monastery. Craftsmanship spread from one kingdom to another. The medieval inn, with all its smoke, noise, crowded beds, muddy floors, restless horses, questionable mattresses, and determined insects, quietly made much of that possible. It was rarely elegant, often inconvenient, sometimes genuinely miserable. Yet it offered something no weary traveler could easily replace. A roof against the rain, a fire against the cold, food after a long day's journey, a stable for faithful animals, a few hours of uncertain sleep before another sunrise. For people who spent their lives on medieval roads, that was often enough. And so our sleepy journey comes to an end. The fires in the inn burn low, the last quiet conversations fade into silence, and the travelers drift into another imperfect night's sleep beneath rough wooden beams. History rarely learned its lessons, royalty rarely improved their decisions, roads remained muddy with admirable consistency, and somehow humanity kept moving forward anyway. The merchants continued trading, the pilgrims kept walking, the scholars carried their books, the innkeepers welcomed another evening's guests, and the old roads patiently waited for tomorrow's footsteps beneath the same wide sky. Sleep came where it could, comfort appeared when fortune allowed, and another ordinary day quietly became part of history. Good night.